Hi, everyone. My name is Faye Park, and I'm the president of US PIRG. Welcome to our live stream conversation with Richard Cordray. Rich was the first director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and under his 6 years of leadership, the CFPB returned some $12 billion to over 31 million consumers victimized by financial schemes and unfair practices. His new book, Watchdog, chronicles the CFPB's battles and victories during his tenure. The COVID-19 pandemic is first and foremost a public health crisis, but it has very quickly become an economic crisis as well, not just globally, but at the most intimate individual level as well. We're pleased to welcome Mr. Cordray here to help consumers navigate the financial problems brought on by the pandemic. I'm also joined by my long-term PIRG colleague, Ed Mrzwinski, who helped establish the coalition Americans for Financial Reform, which fought for Wall Street reform and to establish and defend the CFPB from attacks by powerful special interests. For those of you who are joining by Zoom, you can submit questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And for those of you that are watching us on Facebook, you can post questions as comments, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. And don't forget, we have COVID-19 consumer tips at uspirg.org. With the URL posted in the comments and chat pages of the Zoom chat and the Facebook live stream. So since I'm moderating, I get to ask the first question. And I hope it's okay that I'm calling you Rich instead of Director Cordray. Again, for joining us. Of course, we know everyone is concerned about the pandemic's effect on the economy. Millions of Americans have lost jobs and will have trouble paying their bills. Let's just start with what I think is going to be a fairly easy question. But what advice can you offer those people? Which bills should they pay first?
Yes, thank you, Faye, and thank you to PIRG for setting up this technology-enabled meeting. I'm glad to join you at least virtually, if not in person. And as to your question, as we all know, for consumers, the biggest problem that a consumer can run into is not having money coming in the door, not having their normal income, not having any sort of financial support. The federal government is going to be sending out stimulus checks here shortly. It'll be a far cry from the actual take-home income of many people. It's of grave concern. We have on our way, probably tomorrow, we will learn the total will have climbed to 22 million Americans who have filed new unemployment claims in the last month. This is a cataclysmic economic collapse, and it means that unemployment is going to be spiking above 15%. So what do you do in that situation? First of all, you have to prioritize paying your bills. You may not be able to pay them all. If you don't have that cushion of savings that most Americans do not have, you have to think about, can you get some relief on your rent or your mortgage, which is typically people's biggest cost, the housing cost. There is, under the CARES Act, there is relief provided to a sort of patchwork quilt of mortgages in this country. About 54% of the mortgage market is covered, and you can actually skip a payment and it can be dealt with down the road, and that may be a good alternative for many people. You may also be able to work with your lender to skip a payment or two or three by organizing a workout. That's very arduous, it's time consuming, it can be very difficult to get these people on the phone at a time when there's high call volumes, but that's worth trying to do. There is relief from evictions if you're a rent payer who doesn't own your home. Under certain emergency orders in a number of states that governors have imposed, and under a smattering of landlord-tenant relationships, depending on how the landlord finances their mortgage under the CARES Act. Many of us would like to see that relief expanded across the entire marketplace so that consumers don't have to deal with the complexity of, do I have a Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac mortgage? Does my landlord have some kind of mortgage that's covered under a small program like that? In addition, people are falling behind on auto loans. They're falling behind on credit card bills. And again, they have to prioritize those. This is a time where revolving a balance on a credit card may be your best option. It's high cost for many people. It can range from anywhere from 10 to 36% rate of interest. It is far preferable, though, to taking out some sort of payday loan, which can be triple-digit interest rates. You may feel like, gee, if I can just get through the next 2 or 3 weeks, I'll be okay. But many of those payday loans, you'll end up trapped in a cycle of debt for a long time to come. The other thing that you can do is, if need be, go to family and friends, seek help from people. But it's going to be a difficult time for consumers in this country right now. We don't know how long it's going to last. I believe it's going to last longer than people think, and it's going to be of grave concern. And I'm worried about consumers right now.
Yes, and you had a piece published in the Washington Post earlier today that talks about the ways in which the consumers are going to suffer, and we can't just hope that consumers will get us out of the economic crisis.
Yeah, I did. I published a piece in the Washington Post this morning, and the piece makes the point that the economic recovery, which has been sustained over 11 years, of course, started under President Obama with the recovery from the financial crisis, and has been a slow but steady recovery for 11 years, which of course now is out the window as this crash has come upon us. But in the later years of that recovery, it was very much robust consumer spending that was driving the economy forward. You know, there's different inputs from businesses and business investment, different inputs from imports and exports, different inputs from the government, but the bulk of our economy is driven by consumer spending, and it had held up well, consumer spending and consumer confidence. I think, though, that coming out of this trough, very severe cliff that we've fallen off of, we're not going to be able to count on the consumer to prop up the economy. Many are going to remain unemployed. People haven't absorb the true situation here. The Congressional Budget Office projects that unemployment, which was at 3.5% just 2 months ago, is going to remain as high as 9%, almost the worst of the depths of the last financial crisis, all the way to the end of 2021. So not just this year, but next year. And for people who've fallen behind on major obligations, and that's going to be happening, it's happening now, it's going to happen over the next several months, they're not going to have discretionary income. They're going to have to catch up and make payments on those debts that they've gotten behind on. And I think people are going to be cautious coming out of it. They'll be cautious about their financial situation, and they'll be cautious about mingling and circulating in the general population in the way that we were so used to doing and took for granted up until this year. And for all those reasons, I think the notion that we're going to bounce right back with a V-shaped recovery and everything will be back to normal doesn't reflect the reality on the ground for many households across America.
Okay, thanks. Ed, do you want to jump in now with a question?
Sure. Thanks, Rich, and we appreciate you getting on the show with us. My first question, Rich, is the CFPB was created after the 2008 collapse brought on by Wall Street excesses. How is this problem with the economy different than the problem that you first faced when you took over the CFPB? What's the same and what's different about the situation?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ed. And we all have our own unique perspective, those of us who lived through the financial crisis of 2008 and the recession of 2009, 2010. I had that perspective. I started into that period as a public official in Ohio, first at the local level, then at the state level. And we began to see this foreclosure crisis washing over. At first, it was limited to the Midwest. Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana were the leading states for foreclosures for a couple of years before it became a national phenomenon and went to the so-called sand states on the West Coast and in Florida. But that was a housing-driven mortgage market crisis. There was tremendously irresponsible lending. Underwriting standards were deteriorated dramatically, and that drove that crisis. It was also, although a deep recession, more of a normal recession in the sense that it unfolded sort of relatively slowly over time. There were lots of warning signs, and we kind of tumbled into it. This situation, which of course is caused by something very different, the pandemic, has been unique in the speed with which it has happened. We've come to an abrupt halt of much economic activity, much business activity, and people have fallen really, as I say, off a cliff into unemployment. and into situations where a lot of businesses are going to fail, particularly small businesses. The federal government likes to think that it's big and powerful, and it puts out these loans for small businesses, and that'll solve the problem. But the amount of money is just a pittance compared to the small business portion of the economy. Many of them will fail, and a lot of people will lose their jobs, and it will take time to put all these pieces back together. It won't just happen immediately. It's unlikely to do so. It took us years to get back to where we had been, and many communities never did with the housing crisis and the financial crisis of 11 years ago. It will have a differential impact this time as well. We've already seen the face-to-face economy has been decimated as compared to the so-called digital economy, which is held up reasonably well because a lot of people are able to do their work in the way we're handling this session here. But for people who need to do their work face-to-face, they don't have that luxury. They have lost their jobs, or they have had severely reduced hours, and they may be also facing the risk of being in the face-to-face economy. I think we're likely to have big changes in our society coming out of this whenever we do come out of it.
Thank you for that. Your book, which I also recommend, Watchdog, has a long section on what happened after you left the Consumer Bureau and acting director Mick Mulvaney took over. You have some harsh words about his reign over the CFPB, but then although you wish new director Kathy Kraninger had maybe done some things differently, not the way you would have done them, you would have preferred she do this instead of that, but you basically said, but the CFPB is still running as Congress intended it to run. Then last week, you issued a memo to Director Kraninger where you pivoted and you basically said, it's time for the CFPB to protect consumers. Obviously, I think the reason was COVID-19. Can you talk about why you changed your mind and what frustrates you about the CFPB and what it should be doing?
Sure, and you'll see over each of my shoulders, almost like military epaulets, my copies of my book, Watchdog, which just came out last month. And it tells a story, a broad story, Ed, as you know, about consumers, that is all of us, and what life is like for consumers, and how important consumer finance has come to be in our lives. It's very central to our lives. We all live on credit, whether that's mortgages or student loans, which didn't really exist when I first went to college in any degree, auto loans, which are a big feature of people's lives, and of course, credit card bills, which is a convenience for many people, but those who revolve a balance end up paying a lot of interest on those. And the reality of life in America in 2020, which is very different from life in America in 1950, is that consumer finance enters into our lives on a daily basis. It is behind a lot of decisions we make. If we go to buy a car or a house, we have to deal with financing, and sometimes it can be complex. The whole point of the Consumer Bureau, as you know, and by the way, my thanks again to everybody in US PIRG and to those who joined and created the Americans for Financial Reform organization that first helped create the CFPB and fought for its passage in the Congress, and then were our champions in not only defending the CFPB against its critics and its foes who wanted to undermine it, but also in pushing us on a daily basis to do more for consumers, to really keep in mind and keep in front of our eyes the mission of the Bureau and how important it was. So you talk about the fact that in the later part of my tenure, and I was up against the end of my term, I spent a year staying on under President Trump. President Obama, as I mentioned in the book, had asked me to try to stay on as long as I thought I could reasonably be effective. And we had some big fights that I detail in the book over lending, over the arbitration clause, over prepaid cards during that year. But as we came to the end of my tenure and I was going to have to step down, the unfortunate choice that President Trump made was to fill the position on an interim basis with Mick Mulvaney, who was an acknowledged opponent of the Bureau, didn't believe in it, had called it a sad, sick joke, and had been opposed to us in Congress. He did not damage the Bureau as much as it seemed during his year there, And by the end of that year, he actually acknowledged that the CFPB is here to stay and is an important part of our government. I thought that was telling. Then Kathy Kraninger was nominated and confirmed by the Senate to become the new director. She was certainly a calming a force in the wake of Mick Mulvaney, who had been so disruptive and didn't have the background of hostility to the Bureau. She has more of a background as an administrator, and I assumed she would run the Bureau reasonably effectively, although no question, not nearly as committed to being aggressive in holding financial companies accountable to the public the way we were under my tenure. Now, you mentioned that I published a white paper last week with two of my former colleagues, Diane Thompson and Chris Peterson. And in the white paper, we said, this is a moment right now that's going to last for some period of time where we're in a crisis. And this is not business as usual. And I think the CFPB has been misreading the current crisis. This is not a time to see this as businesses need help. We need to ease off on businesses and let them have a lot of leeway. Because if those businesses are consumer finance companies, if they're banks, if they are mortgage lenders, mortgage servicers, if they're debt collectors and credit reporting companies, if you ease off of them and don't make them do their jobs, consumers will bear the brunt of that. Consumers will be harassed by debt collectors. Consumers will have credit reports that are inaccurate, that don't reflect their true credit worthiness. And most immediate to me, if mortgage servicers are allowed to have leeway and they don't answer the calls, they don't follow through, and we saw plenty of that in the wake of the last financial crisis, then people won't get the relief on their mortgages that they need. They will fall into foreclosure. They will lose their housing. They will be upset in their lives for years to come. And so I felt that I had been tried to be reasonable with the leadership, understand that there are disagreements, and some of them I feel strongly, but different people will have different directions that they set. But in this time of crisis, we really need to step up, and the Consumer Bureau needs to be what it's supposed to be, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And we listed a number of action steps that need to be taken right now that I think are quite important. And we also shopped that white paper to state officials around the country who can do some of these things and can keep the pressure on as well, state attorneys general and state financial regulators.
Great answer. And before I turn it back to Faye for another question, I'll just say that I recommend the book as well. I don't have two of them to put up as epaulets, but I would urge people go to Amazon Kindle or Barnes & Noble Nook, or get it mailed to you in hard copy. I prefer books in hard copy as well.
And if you really love it, you can get that second copy as well.
Great. Okay, Faye?
The downside to Kindle is it's less impressive to hold up. In that memo that you wrote and published on medium.com last week, you talk about how the CFPB's consumer complaint system can help find out from consumers what is happening and share the news widely, was the tip, the bullet point in that memo that you wrote. As you know, US PIRG has studied the public consumer complaint database that you set up at CFPB. Can you explain further what you mean by find out what is happening? Do you anticipate widespread problems with banks or mortgage companies or debt collectors, for example, not following the law?
Sure, and by the way, US PIRG has been the gold-plated example of an organization around the country that really understood what we were trying to do at the Consumer Bureau. And of course, you urged us on all along. We were trying to create a voice for consumers. I devote chapter 5 of my book to this subject. And I at first had some concern that it would seem like a boring kind of detailed chapter, but it really is the heart and soul of what the Bureau was all about. Consumers got a voice because they could file complaints. We could know and hear from them in real time what their challenges were, what their problems were. So even though I might have had certain preconceptions about what the agenda of the Bureau should be, or we might have been sitting in our ivory tower deciding, what we thought was best, we heard directly from consumers. We heard their stories, and they told us what they needed. And PIRG, of course, took advantage of the public database to write, and continues to write, very insightful reports about what consumers are telling us in case we happened to be missing the point, and helped other regulators at the state and federal level understand in more real time. By the way, this is one of the problems in terms of financial oversight. You often work with data, and data comes with a lag. Data has to be collected, compiled, organized, analyzed, and it often is months and months out of date. Whereas a consumer complaint database is real time. People pour their complaints in there, more than 30,000 per month, and we get a real picture of what's going on. Why I think this is so valuable in this current crisis is we're in an unprecedented situation. We know that. We have not been in such a fast decline, a cratering as bad as this. This is far, far worse in terms of its speed than the financial crisis of 11 years ago. So we can't assume that we know exactly what's happening to consumers. I have a lot of sense of what I believe is happening because we've been through something like this before, but not exactly this. So again, we need to hear from consumers as to what their challenges are. Are they getting the mortgage relief that's promised or not? Are they being evicted from their homes, even though many governors have said that evictions should not be occurring in their states? Are they being harassed by debt collectors who, as we know, get paid on commission and are going to have a harder time collecting debts when people are behind and people are not making income? You know, all of these are issues of grave concern. And I do think that they may be listening. I saw that the Consumer Bureau just today announced that they are going to work together with the Federal Housing Finance Administration and share their data from the Consumer Complaint Database so that we can see whether the mortgage relief is being granted and what kind of problems people are having with their housing. I'm encouraged by that. That's the kind of direction we need to go. We also need action steps. We need enforcement. We need vigorous oversight, as well as sharing information. But sharing information is the first step because it helps you diagnose the problem. The Consumer Complaint Database, in its own strange way, becomes kind of like the virus testing would be if we had testing on a broad scale in our society. It helps us test what's happening to households and consumers day in and day out.
Okay, thanks. When we talk about or encourage consumers to be on the lookout for financial scams and ripoffs, I think most of us tend to picture someone who's shadily working from behind a computer screen in their basement with bad lighting, much like where I'm working right now. But at the CFPB, some of your biggest enforcement actions were against some of the nation's biggest and most reputable banks, and you recovered several $billion from them for consumers. Were you surprised that it wasn't just the sort of fly-by-night payday lenders, perhaps, taking advantage of American consumers?
No, Faye, I was not surprised, in part because I had some background of having been a local official, seeing the foreclosure crisis come upon us due to often the incompetence or the indifference of mortgage servicers. I then had been the Attorney General of Ohio, and you're right to say there are plenty of shady operators who, as horrific as it sounds, look for these times of crisis and look for occasions in which consumers are desperate because they know that's the time when they can potentially be most susceptible to scams and fraud. And by the way, they are inserting themselves right now into this process of receiving the $1,200 stimulus checks, trying to pretend to people that if you want to get your check, if you want to get the full amount, or if you want to get it faster, you need to share your bank account information with these shadowy people on the internet who you don't really know who you're dealing with. They can look very legit. Anybody can mock up a website, or anybody can send you a mailing or call you on the phone, but you should be very reluctant always to share your financial information unless you know exactly who you're dealing with and you initiated the contact. They also are inserting themselves. They know people are desperate for testing or for treatment or medicine, and they have all kinds of grand claims that they're making. But those are the shadowy businesses. There's plenty of those. It's a constant effort to try to root them out and knock them down. But at the same time, the big financial companies, and I talk about this in my book, Chapter 6 is all about enforcement and oversight, and I call the Bureau a powerful force for good, which I believe it was and is and could be if enforcement were reinvigorated again, that keeps the companies on the straight and narrow. there are lots of reasons why companies can be incentivized to violate the law to get an advantage. And if some companies are doing it, other companies have a hard time resisting because they either lose market share to those engaged in wrongdoing or they ape their activities. And we saw the mortgage servicer robo-signing scandal, where companies were defrauding consumers by falsifying affidavits to fill out their files and be able to show the evidence in court to justify a foreclosure when they didn't really have the evidence. That happened on a massive scale. That became a multi-$10 billion enforcement action. And we had enforcement actions all the way through against all of the biggest banks, many of the biggest financial companies in every sector of the consumer economy. And they just make mistakes from time to time, and sometimes they do wrong things and don't want to really quite appreciate what they're doing to their customers. And that's why having somebody look over their shoulder, having somebody make sure that they're complying with the law is exactly how markets should work. Markets work not because they're totally free to engage in random activities, whatever happens to put the most money in their pockets, but because they're complying with law and order in an orderly process, and the rules of the game are sensible and they're even-handedly enforced. That's very important.
And then one thing I'd like to add for our audience members is that, just going back to the consumer complaint database, even if there is a less rapidly motivated director in place, because that database is public, groups like ours and other independent consumer watchdogs can take advantage of that and the database and use the information to shine a light on and make recommendations about policy solutions and just tips that we can publicize for consumers to benefit from and unfortunately learn from other people's misfortune.
And let me generalize that point, Faye, because I think what we did in the area of consumer finance at the Consumer Bureau is something that could be done across the entire federal government and across state government too, for that matter. The public has a right to know and deserves to know what's going on in our society, what the problems are, and then they can better assess whether government is being effective at addressing those problems. We were not the originals in terms of having a public database. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration had started this 40 years before, and that data is used now to help assess auto safety, and consumers shop based on that data. It is my hope that over time, consumers will shop in the area of consumer finance based on the data that we have and make choices among different entities depending on how well they serve their customers. And this is definitely an incentive to the companies to engage in better customer service. But this is basic transparency in government. This is government. The people who are the wealthiest, the most influential, who can afford lobbyists, they have access to a lot of information and they use it to their advantage. What we wanted to do was see that middle-class Americans, the average working-class household, also had access to data. And even if they weren't going to spend their evenings digging around in the database, groups like yours could assemble that information, make it available, and teach the lessons to people so that they could benefit by them. And I think that that is very important. And by the way, I know we had a fight over retaining that public database over the past year. And you all were deeply engaged in that, as was the entire universe of Americans for Financial Reform. And you won that fight. And I'm grateful to you for fighting it and making sure that that database remained public and accessible. It is one of the things, I called it the crown jewel of the Bureau, because again, it gave consumers a voice. It allowed individual problems to be handled, and it helped us understand bigger problems, systemic problems. If we had 100 complaints about something, we knew that was more serious and a more widespread problem, and we would investigate and take other steps. And that's how government can be made to work. It should be a back and forth and a dialogue between public and government, not the government just standing off doing its own thing, but interacting with the public and really understanding what the needs are that need to be addressed, and showing the public and the public being able to assess whether they're doing so or not.
Okay, before I give Ed a chance to ask some questions, I do want to let our audience members know If you're participating via Zoom, it turns out the Q&A function is not working. So if you have questions, you should type them into the chat box on the side of the Zoom window. And if you're participating via Facebook, you can go ahead and post your questions as a comment. And we are looking at them, and we will get to as many of them as we can. Ed and I had so many questions that were that were sort of monopolizing the time, but we will turn it over to asking Rich some of the questions that have been submitted. So Ed, go ahead.
Great. Okay. And by the way, Rich, you're talking about the database. Consumers, of course, can also file a complaint with the CFPB in addition to looking at the complaints that other consumers file. So it works in both directions. If consumers file a complaint, that helps get the attention of both the Bureau and their bank. And then other consumers can look and say, do I really want to do business with that bank? I will go and see what people say about it. And if they've got a lot of complaints, maybe I'll go vote with my feet and bank at a credit union, not at a bank, or bank at a community bank, not at a big bank. But you mentioned earlier, and by the way, you can go to cfpb.gov and find the database, or you can go to consumerfinance.gov. Either address works. But I wanted to ask you, you mentioned state attorneys general. I have been seeing quite a bit, and by the way, our full response to COVID-19 at USPIRG, we have a project on consumer tips, we have a project on price gouging, we have a project on making ventilators more available. We're doing quite a bit, and a lot of what we're doing is with the state attorneys general. And I've seen that the Attorney General of Massachusetts has called out this violation. The Attorney General of New York has called out that violation. They're always doing work like that, so it's not new to me. But I want to ask you, why is it important to have the states on the protection of consumers as well as having federal agencies? And I know you're working with California. You might want to bring that up.
Sure, and the relationship here goes back to the very beginning of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB. When Elizabeth Warren recruited me there to head the enforcement team, which was before I then was recommended by her to President Obama to become the director, the reason was she wanted someone that she knew could work with the other state attorneys general. And I had been the Attorney General of Ohio myself. I knew my colleagues. We had worked together on a number of things. And that gives you extra muscle. If you have a broader team with more resources to bring to bear on a problem, clearly you're going to do a better job. You're going to know more, you're going to be able to accomplish more, and you're going to have more clout. The Attorney General had learned this lesson among themselves years ago with the whole tobacco litigation, where they made a huge difference for public health in this country by creating what ultimately became a settlement that restricted tobacco advertising and other sales of tobacco in this country, and really called major attention to that and got a lot of money toward public health efforts. But at the same time, when I was heading the Bureau, we worked closely with state attorneys general. They joined a lot of our major enforcement actions, sometimes one or two of them, sometimes 50 of them. And they always made our work better. And I think they appreciated that we made their work better as well. That's the way these partnerships should work. But under the Dodd-Frank Act, Congress recognized at that time, and it was very far-sighted in this, that consumer protection, financial protection, shouldn't be just at the federal level, although this was now creating a new agency there to do some work that had never been done before, but also should be a team participation joined by state attorneys general and also state financial regulators. And they said specifically that if federal and state law are inconsistent with one another, which often leads to federal law preempting state law, that would not be the regime under the Dodd-Frank Act for the CFPB, but federal law would set a floor, and states were free to go beyond it, even with inconsistent laws, if they were more protective of consumers. That was a real welcome to the states to continue to be aggressive about protecting consumers in the financial marketplace. And they authorized the states to enforce federal law directly, which is not normally the case. Usually state officials enforce state law, federal officials enforce federal law, but here not unprecedented, but it's rare. They had the authority to enforce federal law. I talk in my book about the dynamics of federalism. We're seeing on full display now. States around the country are stepping up and filling the breach as the Federal Consumer Bureau has retreated, especially in the area of enforcement over the last couple of years. And I think that that's well needed and well done by many of the states. You mentioned work I'm doing in California right now with a group, a consumer coalition out in California. We are working with the governor, Governor Newsom, to create an analog to the CFPB at the state level, which involves overhauling the Department of Business Oversight into a consumer financial protection and innovation department. That work is ongoing. Of course, the budget process in California has run into now the buzzsaw of the COVID-19 pandemic. But I think the governor and his people and many in the legislature are realizing the point we're now making, which is this is time where we really need those consumer protections. We really need to put those in place because this is where we're going to protect consumers and keep them from falling into the pit of despair. And the more we can protect consumers, the more we will mitigate the budget aspects of this coming recession. And that is really needed right now more than ever. So it was farsighted of the governor to put this proposal in place. It's in front of the legislature this spring. It'll be either pass or not pass by June 15th. And there could be no better argument for overhauling the state's regulation than the crisis consumers are up against right now, to give those people better tools to protect consumers in California. And by the way, the same should be true across the country.
Thank you.
Okay, I am going to pass on a question that we got from one of our audience members who's participating via Facebook. I think the name is pronounced Kema. And the question is this: Chase, my mortgage holder, is offering a 3-month forbearance on my mortgage and expecting us to pay it all back at the end of that time. What is the likelihood that mortgage companies will relent and allow homeowners to add those months to the end of their mortgage terms? And what can we as homeowners do to obtain relief or force this issue?
Kema, that's a great question. It's a very timely question. It's something I'm very worried about. What's happening right now, as I said, under the CARES Act, supposedly, about half of the people with mortgages are able to get relief by missing a payment or 2 or 3 or going into forbearance for 90 days. However, the CARES Act doesn't tell us what will happen at the end of that period. Now, it is under rules we put in place at the Bureau, there is supposed to be a waterfall used to assess the different possibilities, such as tacking those 3 months on the end of your mortgage so that your payments won't go up at all. You'll just simply extend your mortgage by the 3 months that you didn't pay. That's a very reasonable thing for lenders to do, and many of them have done that in the past. That's what Chase should be doing with you, offering you that alternative. Another possibility is that they prorate it over a longer period. So for example, you'll have to pay your normal mortgage payment once you come through the forbearance, plus some portion of the amount that you accrued. But the idea that if people can't pay their mortgage today when it's due, that they're going to pile up 3 months of unpaid mortgage and then be able to pay it all off at the end of that process when they haven't had the money to do it in the meantime is just a recipe for failure. That's absolutely going to create a lot of foreclosures. It is not what the banks should be doing. That's why I think that the Congress should be offering broader relief to the entire mortgage market here. And that's what Chase should be doing in their own self-interest. And many of us will continue to bring pressure on these financial institutions. They're getting a lot of money from the Federal Reserve right now and from the Treasury to shore up their operations. That money should be being used to look after their customers. And if they're not doing that, shame on them. And we need to keep the pressure on them to make sure that that money flows through and that households and people on Main Street get that help, not just the people on Wall Street.
Okay, I do want to note we have actually a lot of questions that we're hoping that we can go through. So I'm going to try to keep Ed's and my comments to a minimum. I know that we both can, talk for a long time, but so if we could try to keep things moving along so we can hit as many of these questions as possible, that would be great. Okay, so this is a question from Erica. What do you think of the CFPB and the Fed and other banking regulators encouraging banks to issue small dollar loans?
And by the way, I have a tendency to answer in long paragraphs. So
I didn't say that.
I'll try to move into the lightning round here. What do I think about encouraging banks to offer small dollar loans? If those loans are reasonable and reasonably priced, that would be a great thing. That would be meaningful competition against the payday lenders. But if those small dollar loans are priced at triple-digit interest rates and they merely ape the payday lenders, then all we've done is taken a bad business model and expand it further. So I think it much depends on what kind of small dollar loans we're talking about. If banks and credit unions are offering small dollar loans for reasonable interest rates and thinking about the ability of the consumer to repay those loans and adopting that principle, I think that could be a very good thing. But if they're going to be simply entering the payday lending industry on the same terms as the payday lenders, then the oversight has completely failed here. And we are taking a bad product for consumers that puts them into a lot of distress and nationalizing it. That would be a terrible thing.
Okay, next we have a two-part question from Cynthia. Part one is, I am lucky to have a pension as well as collecting Social Security. I'm wondering what happens to my pension as the pension fund loses in the tumultuous stock market. Might my pension be reduced?
Okay, so I don't know from the question whether we're talking about a private pension fund or a public pension fund. Private pension funds, like many labor unions have developed over time, tend to be at the mercy of their own finances. And at a time when returns are going to be lower, there may be adjustments there. If it's a public pension fund, those are promises that were made by the government. They're often enshrined in law. And the terms that have already been secured for you are the ones that you're supposed to continue to carry out. There may be changes in the pension funds for current people who have not yet retired, but for what's already due you as a retiree, you should be able to collect that on a public pension system. Now, there's much more to that, but I'll leave it at that for the sake of trying to provide a shorter answer.
Okay. And for what it's worth, the second part, it wasn't actually a two-part question, but additional information. It's the University of California. So a pretty sizable fund.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, hang on. Okay, here's the next question from Michael. The problem is the screenshot that I've received is, oh, here we go. Okay, from your perspective at the state level, what would you say the top legislative priority should be for a state elected official? If only one thing could be accomplished in this moment, where should the push be?
So that's a very hard question. It's sort of like saying which of your children would you be willing to sacrifice? So it's hard to answer that. But I will say that, and my background is colored a little bit by my experience with the previous crisis, I think making sure that we have broad scale housing relief on mortgages and for relief from being evicted for non-payment of rent is the most important thing right now. And let me lay out the logic of that. Right now, to fight this pandemic, one of the things that is being ordered for many households across the country in most states is stay-at-home orders, that you are to shelter in place and remain in your home during the duration of this emergency, however long it may last. How can you do that if you're not able to stay in your home? If you're going to be ousted from it by a foreclosure or by an eviction for failure to pay rent. Now, people should and will try, I'm sure, to keep up with their obligations, because when they fall behind, they're going to suffer the miseries of that. It's going to go on their credit reports. It could lead to bankruptcy. It could lead to foreclosure or eviction. But at a time when people are hard hit, really through no fault of their own, nobody's suggesting that these 22 million people are losing their jobs because they suddenly decided to quit working. That's not what's happening here. It's a national catastrophe. We need to make special arrangements to help people remain in their homes and be able to obey those stay-at-home orders and not circulate. What happens if you're evicted or if you're foreclosed on? You have to move housing. That's going to involve lots of face-to-face contact. It's going to involve a lot of problems for your family. We don't need that right now during this time of emergency. And again, big financial companies, the big banks are getting a lot of money made available to them. It's in the trillions of dollars through these Federal Reserve funding facilities. They need to be passing that on to their mortgage holders and the people who can't make their payments right now. And then they should tack it on to the back of the mortgage. That's the right way for them to handle it. It is the only right way for them to handle it, giving people some choices there and not suggesting that if you don't pay, it'll all be due in a lump sum, which they know darn well won't work. And that means they're not trying hard enough to make things work for people.
Okay, this next question is from Abby. Can you talk about student loans and private loans, which is not addressed in the CARES Act? Are you concerned for when repayments begin for federal loans that the loan servicers will not have the resources to properly assess how much is owed, or that they will not even have enough points of contacts for consumers to make payments again? Should the payment freeze be extended for all loans and beyond September 2020, including private student loans?
Yes, Abby, I'm very concerned about this because we have seen that the student loan servicers, much like mortgage servicers, haven't done a very good job, even during times when the economy was doing reasonably well. They haven't allocated payments properly. They haven't served the interests of their customers, making sure that they're paying down their highest interest rate loans first, and often have failed to qualify them for programs they were entitled to, like interest-based repayment on federal loans, where you're supposed to pay less if your income is lower. You'll pay for a longer period of time, but that makes it more affordable for you in the meantime. So I've seen student loan servicers not doing their jobs very well at a time when things were relatively smooth in the economy, even though the student loan problem has been growing. But now that we're in a crisis, they are going to undoubtedly have more problems. They're going to have more call volumes. They're going to have a harder time responding to individual situations. Some of my former colleagues have formed the Student Borrower Protection Project, which is doing great work around the country and making sure that state officials are getting involved in addressing this problem. What we need is a period of forbearance for student loans. Why? For the very same reason as we're having it for mortgage forbearance, because people are losing their jobs, they're losing hours, they're not making the same amount of income. It is not through their fault. It's due to a pandemic that is undermining our economy. All this money that's being made available from the federal government needs to be used in part to help these people through this crisis, whether that's 0% interest for some period of time, or some forgiveness, or at least some forbearance on the due payments, and then they should again be tacked onto the back end, not required to be repaid all at once. Okay.
The next question is from Matthew. How do we prevent unaccountable bureaucrats from spending $215 million on office renovations and from attacking legal businesses through initiatives like Operation Choke Point?
Okay, that sounds like somebody who was a critic of the Bureau, and those were talking points that some of our critics used against us. But essentially what I would say is we were not attacking legitimate businesses. We were attacking businesses that violated the law to get an advantage in the marketplace at the expense of consumers. And if you look at our enforcement actions, 90% or more of the money we got back for consumers came in actions where the companies were engaged in deceptive behavior. They were lying to or cheating or misleading their customers. That's not acceptable in any marketplace. As for office renovations, that issue eventually petered out because it was shown, and our Inspector General had a report that the costs of the renovations to the Consumer Bureau's facility were reasonable and in line with other government work, and she preserved an asset that is located right across the street from the White House from falling into disrepair, and therefore preserved an asset that's an important one for the federal government.
Okay, I'm having a little bit of technical difficulty with my phone, which is how I'm getting the questions. Ed, can you ask one of your questions that you have?
Oh, sure. I've got many questions. Rich, the end of your book has a message of hope. It says that The CFPB, creation of the CFPB shows that our government can be realigned to serve ordinary Americans, not only those at the top of the pyramid. And then your memo to Director Kraninger last week also has a message of hope. It says the CFPB is well positioned essentially to help during this COVID-19 crisis. But the people with oversight over the CFPB, including the American public, need to make sure that this happens. What is your advice to the American public? How can our viewers and our members, how can they help make it happen that the CFPB does its job and helps to protect Americans from the financial fallout of the pandemic?
That's a great question, and there are many ways that people can help. To begin with, they can participate in the process as we talked about. When they have a problem with a financial company, file a complaint. It's very easy to do at consumerfinance.gov. Takes usually less than 15 minutes and helps hold these companies' feet to the fire, and often may lead to some relief in your case. But at a minimum, alerts people that there's a problem that needs to be dealt with. Another way, and part of the reason for me writing the book Watchdog, was to help make sure that the public is aware of the importance of having some of the government, hopefully all of the government, standing on their side, looking out for them, putting their interests first, not simply serving the top 1% who are the richest and most powerful and have the clout in Washington, D.C., but making sure that our government serves the public interest and serves those middle-class, working-class families all over the country who deserve to have a voice and have it be listened to as well. Another way people can make the difference is in elections. Making sure that the people in public office are the ones who are looking out for them, who are working on their behalf. They're not doing the bidding of, again, some of the big companies that already have all the advantages in Washington, D.C. And that's another way that they can matter. And by the way, those of you on this call who are involved in an organization like the Public Interest Research Group, you're making a difference by being involved, by supporting its efforts. Those two are helping turn the government in the direction of the broad group of Americans and not just those who have all the advantages under our system. We complain about a rigged system. It's only rigged if we let it be. We can make a big difference as to whether that's the case or not.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep. So I have a question from Jillian. Is there any advice for individuals with student loans? My servicer let me know my next payment is not due until November, but I am always nervous of hidden fees and interest. I go through Nelnet and have bad experiences with them in the past. I have a public loan. I wanted to see if your advice would be to keep up with payments as best as possible, or more information also, or if you have any more information also about possible hidden interest and fees.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's hard to give people financial advice unless you can see the full financial picture of what their situation is. But I would say that if you can keep up with the payments, you should do so. If you find that you can't and you have to prioritize other obligations because you don't have the coming in, then you need to make very hard-headed choices about that. I would put your housing first. And in many parts of the country, if you lose your auto, that's going to be a significant blow to your ability to get to the store or get food at a food bank or get to your job if you're trying to work, or even getting to the doctor for a medical emergency. By the way, there's a couple of states, Massachusetts and Illinois, that have put in place restrictions on the repoing of autos during this emergency. And I think it would be great if every state did that, but Massachusetts and Illinois have found a way to do that so far. And I would encourage other state officials to look at doing the same. Again, if you're not in an area where there's mass transit, and much of the country doesn't have good mass transit, you really need that auto as a lifeline. But if you can keep up with your payments, do that. If they're federal loans, make sure you're on income-based repayment if you want to relieve some of the burden of what the payments might be. And those are some of the pieces of advice I would give.
Okay, Rich, I've got another question. I've got many, like Faye said, but we haven't talked about Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo. So way back when you were directing the CFPB and the tiny City of Los Angeles Attorney's Office took a case to the public that Wells Fargo had been cheating its customers and forcing low-paid frontline workers to open fake accounts so that they would meet quotas. You brought them to heel, but since then, other agencies continue to go after Wells Fargo and its board. Were you shocked to see that the Wells Fargo problems continue? The culture over there, the board failing to do its job? What do you think?
No, Ed, I wasn't shocked by that because changing a culture takes some time. It doesn't just happen with one sharp incident. By the way, the Wells Fargo matter is a great example, again, of a partnership where the Consumer Bureau teamed up in that case, as you say, with the Los Angeles City Attorney's Office. I'll be friends for life with Mike Fewer as a result. He's a tremendous public official. He started that lawsuit and we came together to help finish it. And we did a very good job. And one of the things we did was we blew the whistle on and exposed some very systemic problems at Wells Fargo. And we then passed referrals on those to many others. We passed a criminal referral to the Justice Department, and they then followed through and got billions of dollars more in relief. And they're still looking at potentially prosecuting some of the officials involved. I was a little surprised at the absolute extent of the reaction to the Wells Fargo situation. Although it was outrageous conduct, it didn't involve that much actual monetary harm to individuals. But the notion that they were opening bank accounts without people's knowledge and moving money around without people's awareness to serve their own interests, to get their own bonuses, to pump up their stock price, it was just so outrageous, so out of touch with what a banking institution is supposed to be, a trusted institution that takes careful care of my money and makes sure I know exactly what's happening to it. They deserved all of the opprobrium that has been visited upon them.
Thank you for that, Faye.
Okay, now we have a question from Chris. There are a lot of local Facebook groups popping up in my feed where these landlord issues are happening, which I assume means landlords threatening to evict people because they can't make rent. Where should people be voicing these concerns?
Well, there are, if you're in a city, there are mayors who have stopped evictions where they have the ability to do that, or they're asserting emergency powers to do that. In quite a number of states now, the governors have halted evictions. They have said that although they can't necessarily control what goes on in the courts, they can, the officials who would carry out an eviction are stopped from doing so during the period of this crisis. Again, why? Because it only makes sense that if you're being ordered to stay in place in your home, that you shouldn't be ousted from your home. I mean, that is just basic logic, it seems to me. So you can take a look and see what your state government is doing. You can ask around to your public officials. You should put pressure on them to provide relief if they haven't yet. But beyond that, you know, it's tough situations for people.
Okay, hey, Rich, we've got another question from Jason on Zoom. It's a little bit technical, but I know you can explain it to the people on the call. But how do you feel about the decision by the Federal Housing Finance Agency to not offer liquidity to mortgage servicers as forbearance requests skyrocket?
Well, Ed, I know I can answer that question. I just don't know if I can do it quickly. So this is another example of what I was talking about a moment ago. There's lots of help being made available through different financing sources in the federal government to these companies. And the whole purpose of that right now during this crisis should be so that they can then offer help in turn to their customers, so that it actually flows down to the people on Main Street around the country who are in stress right now. So, for example, when I say that you should be able to forego your mortgage payment for a month or two or three, And again, some of the market that is being permitted and some of it it's not, and it's too complicated for most people. What does that mean? That means the mortgage servicer, who normally takes the payment and passes it on to those to whom it's owed, doesn't have the money suddenly. So they need to have some sort of backstop so that that relief can be made available. The FHFA has been helping Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to build up their capital for quite some time now. They have plenty of capital available to deal with this crisis. The head of the FHFA doesn't seem to want to let them do it because he's got his heart set on recapitalizing these companies and getting them out of conservatorship. But he's missing the point here. We're in a crisis right now. We're in an emergency situation. That capital needs to be available so that people don't lose their homes and we end up in a crisis that's going to cost Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac tremendous amounts of money if we end up with an upside down housing market, as we saw happen just 11 years ago. This isn't rocket science. This isn't some sort of gazing into a crystal ball. We know what happened 11 years ago and we can see it happening again. And he may think that maybe somebody else in the government, the Treasury or the Federal Reserve, will bail out these mortgage servicing companies, but they're not going to be able to provide the relief unless they have the financing, and the FHFA should step up and provide it right now.
Okay, now we have a question from Karen. Please talk about the importance of civil legal aid in helping consumers to address the issues that you all discussed today.
Well, I say in my book Watchdog that the real heroes and often unsung heroes of the financial crisis were not the people at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, although we did our part, but it was homeowner counseling, housing counselors, and legal aid attorneys, who were the ones who could actually sit elbow to elbow with people and help them work out their situations, and if need be, went to court on their behalf and fought for them. And we used to have regular calls with a network of legal aid attorneys around the country and with housing counselors to understand what they were seeing, because I knew that they knew best what was happening to people. And they were the ones who spent their days, you know, I'm being asked what advice to give people in financial situations on this call, and, you know, a 30-second question and a 1-minute answer. That's nothing like what housing counselors and financial advisors and legal aid attorneys do. They spend hours with people. They really understand their situation. They help them put it in the best possible context to help themselves and their families. And when need be, they push and make sure that they assert people's rights. Those are the heroes. And I can't say enough about what they do. And we learned a lot from them. And I think the Consumer Bureau could stand to keep learning from them as we go forward.
Great answer, and I totally agree. We need federal agencies to protect us. We need state and local agencies to protect us, but we also need private attorneys, legal aid attorneys. And Russ just pointed out in a question or a comment, actually, that there are many pro bono lawyer hotlines that are being set up all around the country that are helping people with COVID-19 financial emergencies. So we can't be helped by just the federal government. We've never said that. Neither of you.
No, that's right. And, you know, people help themselves to the extent they can, but then they need somebody to lean on. They need somebody who's expert. You know, when I'm facing foreclosure, it may be the first time in my life and the only time in my life. I don't know what to do, but people who've been through it with maybe dozens or even hundreds of others, they're the experts who can really help out, and thank the Lord that they do. And these hotlines that are being set up for pro bono services, again, my deepest appreciation to the people who are spending time doing that. They are making a world of difference.
Okay. By the way, I know that we're past the 7:30 time, East Coast time. We do have a few more minutes to take some more questions. So thank you everyone for submitting them. The next question is from Susan. If you could change one thing about the financial system, what would it be?
Well, no, there's a lot of things I could say, I suppose. I think that if we could orient all of the financial regulators at the federal and state level more directly to the consumer, the way we tried to do with the consumer complaint database, that would make a tremendous difference. and it would help illuminate these issues for people who can often get a bit removed from what's going on in our communities, particularly federal officials. They're in a bubble in Washington, they're in a beltway bubble of politics, and they're in a financial bubble of the fact that the Washington, D.C. area, including Northern Virginia and Southern Maryland, is one of the most prosperous places in our nation. And as a result, they often aren't quite appreciating some of the situations that people are facing around the country. But I would say that if we can keep working to reorient our government to focus on the needs of the middle class and listen to those voices and have mechanisms for them to hear those voices, that would make all the difference in the world, not just in consumer finance, but in environmental protection, in health policy, all across our government.
Okay. I think that we have run through all of the questions. I should have withheld my last comment.
It's a miracle. That's
yeah.
a miracle.
It's a well-known secret that you are a 5-time undefeated Jeopardy champion. And
we're certainly scraping the bottom of the barrel now, Faye. But
well, no, you've demonstrated through this conversation your ability to, answer questions under pressure and not be allowed to say a lot more than just the answer or the question or however it works on Jeopardy. Thank you so much to all of our audience participants and to the US PERG members who make this type of program possible. But most of all, thank you very much, Rich, for your efforts over the years to protect consumers and for establishing systems and tools to enable us as individual consumers, as organizations, and also to enable your successors at the CFPB to continue doing your work. So for everyone else that's been participating, remember to check out our website at usperg.org for resources to help protect your financial well-being. So thank you again and have a good night, everyone.
Thank you, Rich.
thank you.